But why do intelligent people become prisoners of their own minds? By the end of this investigation, you won't just understand Hamlet. You'll understand why some of the smartest people sabotage their own lives. You think your biggest mistakes happen because you acted too quickly, because you spoke too soon, trusted too easily, made the wrong decision. But history tells a different story. Some of the greatest tragedies weren't caused by reckless action. They were caused by hesitation, by waiting, by replaying the same thought over and over until the opportunity disappeared. Think about the last decision you postponed, the message you never sent, the opportunity you kept researching, the apology you rehearsed but never spoke. Maybe you called it being careful. Maybe you called it being responsible. Maybe you called it waiting for the right time. But what if it wasn't wisdom? What if it was fear, wearing the mask of logic? Because the mind has a remarkable ability. It can convince you that standing still is progress, that thinking is the same as moving. And no story exposes this illusion better than Hamlet. Most people believe Shakespeare wrote a tragedy about revenge. He didn't. He wrote one of the greatest psychological studies ever created, about what happens when the human mind becomes its own prison. And the unsettling part is this: long before psychology gave it a name, Hamlet was living through something millions of people still experience today. Not madness, not weakness, overthinking. And once you recognize how it works, you'll start seeing Hamlet everywhere, including in yourself. Imagine discovering that the person you trusted most didn't simply disappear. Someone took them from you. Now imagine learning the person responsible is sitting in your own home, smiling, eating at your table, calling themselves family. That's where Hamlet begins. See the difference? It's emotional, not educational. You think your biggest mistakes happen because you act too quickly, because you trusted the wrong person, said the wrong thing, made the wrong decision. But history tells a different story. Some of the greatest tragedies weren't caused by reckless action. They were caused by hesitation, by waiting, by replaying the same thought again and again until the opportunity quietly disappeared. Think about the last important decision you delayed, the message you rewrote 10 times but never sent, the opportunity you kept researching instead of taking, the conversation you rehearsed in your head but never had. Maybe you called it being careful. Maybe you called it being responsible. Maybe you told yourself, I just need a little more time. But what if time wasn't solving the problem? What if it was becoming the problem? Because the human mind has a strange ability. It can make standing still feel like progress. It can disguise fear as logic. It can convince you that one more day of thinking is one less day of regret. But sometimes, one more day of thinking becomes one more year of waiting. And that's the trap. Not because you're weak, not because you're unintelligent, but because the smarter the mind, the easier it becomes to build convincing arguments for doing nothing. Most people think Hamlet is a story about revenge. It's not. It's a story about what happens when your own mind becomes impossible to escape. And whether you've read Shakespeare or not, you've probably lived part of this story already. Daniel believed he was being smart. At 28, he had an idea for a business. Not just any business. One he couldn't stop thinking about. Every night he watched videos, read books, listened to podcasts, studied successful founders, filled notebooks with plans. Every week, the idea became better. At least, that's what he believed. Whenever someone asked, "So, when are you launching?" Daniel smiled. "I'm just making sure everything is ready." It sounded responsible, professional, logical, until something happened. 3 years later, someone else launched almost the exact same idea. Within months, it had millions of users. Daniel wasn't angry because someone copied him. He was angry because they hadn't. They simply started, while he was still preparing. That moment haunted him. Not because he failed, because he realized something far more painful. He had confused preparation with progress, and once that thought entered his mind, he couldn't stop seeing it everywhere. Hamlet finds himself trapped in a different world. A kingdom instead of a startup. A murdered father instead of a missed opportunity. A crown instead of a business. But the prison is exactly the same. One night, he learns a truth that would shatter almost anyone. His father didn't die naturally. He was murdered. And the man responsible now wears the crown. Not a stranger. Not an invading enemy. His own uncle. The same man who has already married Hamlet's mother. Imagine carrying that knowledge. Imagine sitting at the same table, watching everyone laugh, watching celebrations continue, while you're silently asking yourself, "What do I do now?" Most people think they know the answer. "I'd act immediately." Would you? Or would you want proof? Would you question whether you could trust what you heard? Would you wonder if anger was clouding your judgment? Would you fear making a mistake you could never undo? Because that's exactly where Hamlet begins. Not with revenge, with uncertainty. And uncertainty has a dangerous habit. The longer it stays, the larger it becomes. There's something psychologists have noticed about the human mind. When a decision carries enormous consequences, our brain often does something unexpected. It doesn't become clearer. It becomes slower. Every possibility creates another possibility. Every answer creates another question. Every plan creates another risk. Until thinking stops helping and starts trapping us. This has a name: analysis paralysis. But Shakespeare understood the pattern centuries before psychology did. Hamlet isn't frozen because he lacks intelligence. He's frozen because he has too much of it. Every action creates another consequence. Every consequence creates another doubt. Every doubt creates another reason to wait. And waiting begins to feel safer than choosing. That's why overthinking is so dangerous. It doesn't feel dangerous. It feels responsible. It whispers, "Just think a little longer. Make sure. Don't rush." It never announces itself as fear. It disguises itself as wisdom. And that's why so many intelligent people never realize they're trapped. Because prisons built by the mind don't look like prisons. They look like careful planning. They look like caution. They look like intelligence. But something about Hamlet doesn't make sense. If he's so certain that something terrible has happened, why doesn't he act? Why does he keep searching for more proof? More certainty? More reasons? The answer has almost nothing to do with revenge. It has everything to do with the way your brain responds. When certainty becomes more important than action, and that's where Hamlet's real tragedy begins. You may think you're thinking your way toward the right decision, when you're actually thinking your way away from action. Daniel had spent 3 years preparing. But there was always another question. What if the market changes? What if someone else does it better? What if people don't like it? What if he loses money? Every answer created another question. And eventually, he wasn't researching the business anymore. He was researching his fear. That's an important distinction, because overthinking rarely looks like panic. Sometimes, it looks like productivity. You open another tab, read another article, watch another video, ask another person, make another plan, and for a moment, you feel better because you've done something. But you haven't moved. You've simply found another way to postpone the moment when reality gets to answer your question. And this is where Hamlet becomes uncomfortable. Because Hamlet doesn't simply want revenge. He wants certainty. He wants to know that the ghost is telling the truth. He wants to know that Claudius is guilty. He wants to know that his actions are justified. He wants to know what happens after he acts. And there's nothing irrational about wanting certainty. The problem is that certainty doesn't exist. Not before the decision. Think about something you've been putting off. Maybe it's a career. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's an idea you've wanted to pursue. Ask yourself honestly, what information are you actually waiting for? And more importantly, would any amount of information ever make you completely certain? Probably not. Because that's the trick. Your mind can keep producing questions forever. There is always another possibility, another risk, another scenario, another reason to wait. And the more intelligent you are, the more convincing those reasons can become. Sarah discovered this the hard way. She had been thinking about leaving her job for almost 2 years. She hated the work. She had another opportunity. She had enough savings. Her friends supported her. She knew what she wanted. But she kept saying the same thing. I'm just waiting until I'm sure. Sure of what? That the new job would work. That she'd never regret leaving. That the timing would be perfect. That nothing could go wrong. She was waiting for a future that could guarantee her decision was correct. But no future could give her that guarantee. So she waited. And waited. And every month she became more certain of one thing: she was unhappy. But somehow, still uncertain enough to remain where she was. That's what overthinking can do. It can make the wrong situation feel safer, simply because it's familiar. Hamlet has the same problem. But then he discovers something. He can test the truth. He arranges a performance. The actors will recreate the murder. And Hamlet watches Claudius. He's looking for a reaction, a sign, evidence. Anything that will finally end the uncertainty. And when Claudius reacts, Hamlet gets what he wanted: proof. For a moment, the problem should be solved. But it isn't. Because here's the cruel part. Certainty doesn't automatically create courage. You can know what you should do and still be unable to do it. And that is where many people misunderstand procrastination. They think procrastination means, I don't know what to do. Sometimes it means, I know exactly what to do, but I don't want to experience what happens after I do it. That's different. Because now the enemy isn't confusion. It's consequence. Think about sending that message. You know what you want to say. You type it, read it. Delete it. Type it again. Maybe you're not searching for the right words. Maybe you're searching for a version of the message that guarantees the other person will respond the way you want. That version doesn't exist. So you keep editing. Not because the message isn't ready. Because you're trying to control an outcome you don't control. And that's one of the deepest traps inside Hamlet. He keeps searching for a decision that contains no risk. But every meaningful decision contains risk. That's what makes it a decision. And then something changes. Hamlet begins acting strangely. He pretends to be mad. At first, it looks like madness. But look closer. It's strategy. He's trying to create uncertainty around himself, so he can investigate the uncertainty around him. And this is where intelligence becomes dangerous. Because a clever mind can build an entire world around a problem. Rules, strategies, scenarios, masks, plans, counterplans, until eventually the person isn't solving the problem anymore. They're living inside it. Maybe you've done something similar. You don't call it a mask. You call it being professional. You don't call it avoidance. You call it waiting. You don't call it fear. You call it being realistic. The vocabulary changes. The pattern doesn't. And that's why self-deception is so powerful. You don't have to lie to yourself. You only have to give the truth a more comfortable name. But Hamlet's story is about to become much darker. Because there is another psychological force waiting underneath all of this. Something stronger than uncertainty. Something that can turn thought into obsession. And once obsession enters the equation, Hamlet doesn't just want justice anymore. He wants something else. He wants the world to make emotional sense again. And when reality refuses to do that, the mind begins creating its own version of reality. That is where Hamlet's real descent begins. And once you understand what happens next, you'll start seeing the same pattern in arguments, relationships, revenge, social media, and even inside your own thoughts. When you can't control reality, the mind starts trying to control the story you tell yourself about reality. James didn't think he was obsessed. He thought he was trying to understand what happened. Someone had betrayed him. A friend he trusted for years had lied to him. At first, James wanted an explanation. Then he wanted an apology. Then he wanted the person to understand how badly they'd hurt him. But something changed. He started replaying the conversation every night. What should I have said? Why did they do it? When did they decide to betray me? What if I had noticed earlier? What if I had confronted them sooner? The questions multiplied. And strangely, the more James thought about what happened, the less able he became to leave it behind. He wasn't solving the past. He was repeatedly reopening it. That's what obsession does. It makes repetition feel like investigation. You tell yourself you're looking for an answer. But sometimes, you're simply giving the wound another opportunity to hurt you. Hamlet is doing something remarkably similar. His father's death has become more than an event. It becomes the center of his world. Everything begins pointing back to it. His uncle, his mother, the crown, the ghost, his own identity, even his relationships. The question isn't simply, who killed my father? The deeper question becomes, What does this mean about everything I thought I knew? And that question is much harder to answer. Because when something destroys your understanding of the world, you don't just lose an event. You lose a version of yourself. Think about what happens when someone you trust betrays you. The pain isn't only what they did. It's what their actions force you to reconsider. Were they ever really my friend? Did I miss the signs? Was I stupid? Can I trust anyone else? Can I trust myself? And suddenly, one event becomes an investigation into your entire identity. That's why betrayal can be so psychologically destructive. It attacks the story you were using to understand your life. And when that story breaks, the mind desperately wants to rebuild it. Sometimes with truth, sometimes with assumptions, sometimes with revenge. This is where Hamlet's thinking becomes dangerous, because revenge offers something that uncertainty cannot. Simplicity. Someone did this. Someone is responsible. Someone must pay. The world becomes easier to understand. And that is one reason revenge can feel so powerful. It transforms a complicated emotional problem into a simple mission. Find the enemy. Punish the enemy. Restore the balance. But reality doesn't work that neatly. Revenge doesn't return the person you lost. It doesn't restore the past. It doesn't erase the memory. And it doesn't guarantee peace. It simply gives pain. A direction. James discovered this when he finally confronted his former friend. He had imagined the conversation hundreds of times. In his imagination, he would say exactly the right words. The other person would finally understand. They would apologize. James would walk away feeling free. Instead, the conversation lasted 12 minutes. The apology was weak. The explanation was disappointing. And afterward, James felt almost exactly the same, because he'd spent months preparing for a moment that was never capable of giving him what he actually wanted, closure. He had believed another person could give him peace. But peace was never something that person controlled. Hamlet is caught in a similar trap. He believes killing Claudius will restore something. His father's honor, justice, order. Perhaps even himself. But every step toward revenge pulls him deeper into the world he's trying to escape. The more he thinks about death, the more death surrounds him. The more he investigates betrayal, the more suspicious he becomes. The more he tries to control the outcome, the more uncontrollable everything becomes. And eventually, something extraordinary happens. Hamlet begins questioning not only other people, but existence itself. What does it mean to live? What does it mean to die? What makes suffering worth enduring? And suddenly, a personal tragedy has become a philosophical crisis. This is what happens when thought has no exit. A question doesn't remain a question. It becomes a doorway to another question, and another, and another, until eventually, you're not looking for an answer anymore. You're living inside the questions. Maybe you've experienced a smaller version of this. You receive a strange message. You read it. Something feels wrong. So you reread it. Then you analyze the punctuation. Why did they use that word? Why didn't they add an emoji? Why did they take 3 hours to respond? Did I say something? Are they angry? And suddenly, a 10-word message has become a psychological investigation. Nothing new happened. Only your interpretation changed. That's the terrifying power of the mind. It doesn't need new information to create a new reality. It can take the smallest uncertainty and build an entire world around it. And this is where Hamlet teaches us something much deeper than revenge. The mind doesn't simply interpret reality. It can begin defending the interpretation it has already created. Once you believe someone is against you, you notice evidence that they are against you. Once you believe you're a failure, every mistake becomes proof. Once you believe you'll embarrass yourself, every uncertain reaction becomes rejection. The mind starts collecting evidence for the story, instead of testing whether the story is true. And the longer the story survives, the harder it becomes to question. James eventually realized something uncomfortable. He hadn't spent months trying to understand his friend. He had spent months trying to prove that his pain was justified. Those are not the same thing. One searches for truth. The other searches for confirmation. And once you understand that distinction, you start seeing it everywhere. Arguments, politics, relationships, social media, even inside your own memories. Because sometimes we don't want the truth. We want a version of the truth that makes our feelings make sense. Hamlet wants the world to make sense too. But it doesn't. His father is dead. His mother has remarried. His uncle is king. His friends are uncertain. The ghost may be telling the truth. Or something else may be using his grief against him. Nothing is stable. So Hamlet searches harder, thinks harder, tests people, creates performances, pretends, investigates. And the more he tries to regain control, the more chaotic his world becomes. That's the paradox. Asterisk, asterisk, the harder he tries to control uncertainty, the more uncertainty he creates. Asterisk, asterisk, and maybe you felt that paradox yourself. You check your phone because you're anxious, and become more anxious because you keep checking. You reread the message because you're afraid of misunderstanding, and become more confused because you keep rereading it. You think about the decision because you're afraid of making the wrong one, and become less capable of making any decision at all. The behavior designed to reduce the discomfort starts feeding it. That's the loop. And Hamlet is now trapped inside it. But there is still one thing he hasn't fully understood. Thinking can tell you what happened. It can help you understand why. It can reveal possibilities. But eventually, life demands something thought cannot provide, a choice. And Hamlet is running out of time. Because while he is still searching for the perfect moment, the consequences of his hesitation are already moving around him. The people closest to him are changing. His relationships are collapsing. His enemies are preparing. And the world doesn't pause just because you're still thinking. That's the cruelest part. Life keeps moving while your mind is still deciding. And Hamlet is about to discover just how expensive waiting can become.